Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of the Political Pulse podcast. I am your host, Ryan Painter. I am extremely excited to have Alex Zoltan, crime reporter with True North, here today to talk about several things. Alex has been working and reporting for a couple years now. Alex, thank you so much for joining me for a chat.
Thank you for having me.
Um, Alex, I invited you on because you had a really interesting series of threads just post the election, kind of talking about conservative online pundits, commentators, content creators, and I wanted to talk a little bit about that thread. But before we do, you probably heard, and I know many others have, that there was a killing in DC last night of two Israeli staffers, Yaron Lachinsky and Sarah Lynn Milgram. Um, I'm fucking pissed off about this, and I'm pissed off because we've seen anti-Semitism and the rise of anti-Semitism since the October 7th invasion of Hamas of southern Israel, killing of 1,200 people, kidnapping of 250 hostages. There's still somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 to 60 hostages that I believe are still being held by Hamas. My number might be off there. And we see our political leaders here in Canada, certainly to perhaps a lesser extent in the United States, but certainly here in Canada, have been almost completely mum on the issue of anti-Semitism, save the conservatives, because they have been unanimous in terms of their support for the Jewish community, for the state of Israel's right to defend itself. They've been unapologetic. The liberals used to be that way federally. They're absolutely not now. The NDP, as a political entity for however it exists federally, and they are government in Manitoba and in BC, but they are completely absent of any kind of sympathy, support, or real kind of concrete, hard-lined enthusiasm towards the state of Israel and the Jewish community. So I'm worked up about this. I'm heartbroken that these families have now lost two Israeli staff or two family members from the embassy of Israel. And the only reason why these two were attacked were because they were Jewish. I mean, there's no other reason, right? So, your thoughts, because I'm a mixture of thoughts on this morning.
Sounds like we're kind of on the same page. The Liberals have really abdicated their responsibility to even just take a side, but that's pretty common with Liberals. They like to promise everything and deliver nothing to everyone. So that doesn't come as a huge surprise to me, although it is historically new, as you'd mentioned, that the Liberals have kind of taken this ambivalent approach to the issue.
Why do you think it is? Like, I mean, for me, certainly on the left, and you may or may not be aware, but I was very much on the left for a long time. I was an NDP campaigner, was part of the executive, was probably the proverbial insider. The NDP's failure to really stand up for justice for the Jewish community was a big reason why I left. But why do you think it is that at least the liberals have just completely abandoned the Jewish community?
I think there's a few things going on at once. One of them is just political calculus, right? There's just a lot more Muslims in Canada now than there are Jews. So that's a big reason, right? If you're doing vote bank politics, it's obviously better political calculus to appeal to the Muslim vote versus the Jewish vote. So I think that's one of the biggest reasons. The second reason is that I think it fits within that kind of neo-Marxist, post-truth, university, anything that swims upstream from privilege is good philosophy, right? Is that there's this idea that, Israel is in a place of privilege, and, there's this underdog component to Gaza that appeals to people on the left for very emotional reasons. And so it's consistent with that line of thinking too.
The underdog component thing is interesting because I think there's definitely a point there. Like during my time in the movement, in the party, people were very much, and I didn't notice it as much because I mean I was very much absorbed in it. I've shared that I was probably what could have been considered deeply anti-Semitic for quite a few years in the NDP, and often because that's just very much kind of the cult of being involved in that party. And I think a lot of what kind of comes to the hatred from many on the left for Israel, and therefore it's transferred to the Jewish people, is because of success. Israel's a successful country. Jews, despite everything that they've been through for centuries, whether it's been expulsions and obviously the Holocaust, they are successful. They are a successful people. They have thrived regardless of what's been thrown at them. And I think generally people on the left, not all of them, but many on the left, view success with suspicion. And so I think that that ends up, I think, being a catalyst for a lot of the hate that community experiences. It's
Yeah.
sad.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. And I also think, too, again, returning to the concept of political calculus, the Israel issue is very interesting because it split people on the left and the right in really fascinating ways.
Mm.
And one thing that the left is really good at is, and I guess maybe we'll get to this later, is uniting over ideas that aren't necessarily very logical. Um, and the right is really good at disagreeing over the smallest things, splitting hairs. Right. And so I was just doing an interview earlier. We were talking about Ukraine. Ukraine is another good example where the left does this, right? Is that they've all really like kind of united around Ukraine, whereas it's a very divisive political wedge issue on the right. So it's very convenient for them to have that issue continue to persist, right? Because it's a rallying cry for them and a point of division for us, if you want to call
Well,
us
and
right wing partisans.
yeah, and actually that kind of really transitions into where I want to go with this conversation, which is really kind of talking about where conservatives landed, not specifically voters or organizers, but the content creation community. So I'm just going to share my screen here because you had what I think was a really, really interesting series of tweets just post the election. Um, kind of about where we are, and I'm just going to read this out for viewers. You'll be able to watch this. For listeners, I'm just going to read this thread. It's not super long, but I think there's some important stuff here. And then on the back end of it, Alex, I want you to kind of go a little bit deeper on what you said here. My theory on the last Canadian election, you won't like it. Canadian conservatives of all stripes, be it right of center, small c, big C, whatever, haven't been very kind over the last few years. And yes, I'm talking about you, so please take this very personally. A thread to the conservative right wing creator crowd, which I guess I'm a part of now. Up until this point, you've been right about absolutely everything. You were right about the lockdowns, about vaccines, about the convoy. You even correctly predicted the US election. Good on ya. But Trump came and went, and the Canadian election came along, and everyone started infighting like we're at a Greek wedding. By contrast, Carney's crowd, a big tent housing the CBC, the legacy media, and elbows people, marched in uniform with centrist theocratic LinkedIn discipline. Technocratic, pardon me. Conservative influencers, meanwhile, showed up for open mic night at Madison Square Rumble. One guy going off incessantly about Canada becoming the 51st state. One on why the Joe Rogan podcast will determine the success of Poilievre's campaign. Another about Alberta independence. There was often no message, just vibes. Disconnected, contradictory, sometimes delusional vibes. Poilievre says cut taxes. Cool. But Fry says he's not anti-woke enough. Tisdale calls for Canada to be annexed. Marty and Clyde are talking Alberta independence. I'm not trying to be a dick. I'm a part of the same crowd I'm criticizing, just self-reflective. Instead of cohesion, the very right-wing digital scene, as Rosie Barton and David Cochrane would likely describe us, provided people a mushroom trip of incoherent grievance politics. Could CPC have done better? Of course. Did they make mistakes? Certainly. Could they have been friendlier to the independent media cohort? Probably. But the content creators didn't do themselves any favors by criticizing the CPC every step of the way this election either. Perhaps it's the curse of knowing too much. The boomers collectively and unitedly backed the liberals because they proudly understood nothing, just muttered Trump, Carney banker, steady hands, RSPs, and voted. Meanwhile, the CPC influencer crowd were busy fingering each other over who had the correct conspiracy about nomination races: Max Bernier, Davos, Khalistan, US podcasts, CCP influence, fentanyl, immigration, or who did or didn't like Donald Trump too much or enough. The reason we lost is simple: because we couldn't be nice, not even to each other. Um, Unpack all that for us, Alex. There's a lot there.
Yeah, so I guess if I really wanted to distill that down to a very short pithy statement. I said in another tweet elsewhere that Trump savior syndrome, which is a term that I've coined. I got it from a fellow named Utaka. I think that it was an equally poisonous contagion during the election, and I think it existed primarily on the right, well, exclusively on the right. I think that it was just as bad as Trump derangement syndrome, is that you had a whole bunch of folks, including myself to some extent. Again, this is self-reflective. I'm not picking on anybody. And I said to everybody that I pictured there, I said it was really quite arbitrary. Like, I could have put my own picture. I could have used Rupa, who I also consider to be a friend. I wasn't attacking anybody personally, which, that's why I said take it very personally. I was being satirical and sarcastic.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, there was just it really, Donald Trump really should not have factored into this election at all. Right? He has no true influence over Canadian politics. He has no decision-making power, and yet he dominated the conversation on the left and on the right. The difference is that on the left, they had a consistent and a coherent narrative, which is that we need to fight against the United States, and we need to fight back against the tariffs and so on and so forth. Whereas on the right, it was really disconnected and in the independent content creator side. Now, that's an advantage to the content creator side, right? Is that we don't have to ascribe to any specific newsroom narrative. And that's why I think that they're becoming more popular and they're kind of rendering the left wing legacy media cartel irrelevant. But at the same time, there are certain pitfalls to that. And one of those is that if you are looking for a particular outcome in an election, your audience doesn't really know which direction to go because you don't have a clear pathway or for people to really think, right? I mean, Canada becoming the 51st state, Alberta becoming independent. These are not really important election issues. These are just crazy wedge issues. And like I said, it was just like a mushroom trip of random grievance politics. And I was just as guilty of that as anybody else.
What's interesting in that is that those of us on the right, and whether you say center right, small c, whatever you want to call it, libertarian conservatives, constitutional conservatives, there's all kind of conservatives. And just as a sidebar, I mean, when I started getting more involved in conservative politics, I was of course hesitant. I'm someone who was on the left for quite a while, and I was one of those first who said was kind of talking about joining the conservatives, and a conservative colleague of mine said, "Oh wow, there are orange blue switchers," and I said, "We are out there."
Yeah, I
And this
call us
election,
refugees.
that's right. Yeah, I've
Yeah.
actually got a left UG mug
Oh, there you go.
in my in my cabinet. But I mean, what's interesting is that I find a lot of the comment, I don't know if it's kind of a vying for attention, if it's a desire to be unique or be different or stand out or clickbait, but the grievance politics that I think you correctly point out is often ascribed to the left, as kind of the very identitarian focus, grievance, woke stuff that those on the right or whatever often talk about. But what you talk about here is that, yeah, the Carney crew, the left, they had such a coherent message that they were able to not only form minority government. They've been kind of slowly ticking up their seat count since the election, and they swept NDP seats. Certainly here on the island where I live, which is something that was thought of as kind of impossible for a long time. Um, and there was no kind of salience around what do we do on the right, because if the issue is Trump, there is an issue, I think, of a considerable amount of people on the right, and they may be fringy, but they're loud, who definitely like Trump. You call it that Trump savior syndrome. And they get a lot of attention. And then what those on the left will do, because they're very good at this, they will say, well, that is the representation of Pierre Poilievre. Like, that is who you're going to be electing. So I don't think they quite understand. And it's not necessarily a negative thing, but I don't, when you're in an election, the idea is to win. The idea is to form government. Bitch and complain after, right? But you want to win. Why are you trying to chip the legs out from under the person who's trying to change things? And that's kind of the perspective that I bring to it.
Yeah, and I think that there was people that were suffering from Trump savior syndrome. They abandoned their principles because of it. As an example, if you think it's absurd to think that you can change the weather with taxes, then I think that it's logically consistent that you would find it absurd that you can fix the fentanyl crisis with tariffs.
Mm.
But people who had Trump savior syndrome just completely lost sight of that. They thought, oh no, no, you can get people to stop doing fentanyl by taxes, right? Which is just, it's insane. It just doesn't work that way. And yeah, so I think that Polyev, to his credit, and I'm a bit of a conservative partisan and I'm a big fan of Polyev, he was taking that approach because I think it was consistent with his values. You can criticize Polyev for all sorts of things, but if there's one thing you can't criticize him for, it's that he is consistent. He has always, since high school, been a lower tax, lower regulation person. And so these Trump politics, these tariffs specifically, were an affront to his political beliefs. And so many people thought, well, he should just put his support behind Trump because it will invigorate his base. And I understand the logic behind that, but that's just not in keeping with his values. Right. And I think that his campaign also could have done a better job of explaining that, because even folks like myself who really like Polyev, I thought, well, he's just doing political calculus. He's just trying to steal votes from the left. And that would be smart too. But now in hindsight, looking back on it, I realize that I think his views on Trump are actually quite genuine and rooted in his personal and political beliefs that he's had basically his entire life.
Well, and those views I think are also shared by a lot of Canadians. I mean, and I think to your point, if I mean, look, I've been doing politics for a long time and campaigning and all that, and there's always a post mortem that you have where you look back and you look at the wounds, but you also see what could we have done better, what went well, and what could we have done better, and I think that's healthy. And I wrote an article last week. It was last week or the week before, saying how I actually think that Pierre Poilievre deserves a second shot to try to form government. I'm a firm believer in the two shot chance to form government. Um, one time to kind of get introduced, and then the second time to close the deal. And if you can't close it, then the membership gets to decide. Um, but I think to your point, it was increasingly challenging to kind of see like there are all these people who say you just need to be more like Trump or just need to cater to Trump or do all this other stuff. And it's like, well, no, because the message on the left is already saying that we're like that. Is already saying that Pierre is Trump. And in fact, there were a great many of my own colleagues and friends here in Victoria who, when Trudeau was leader, were saying we hate Trudeau. We're not CBC voters, but we hate Trudeau so much that the Liberals need to get their ass kicked. They need to be put in the penalty box, and we need to just shift, right? And unfortunately, that kind of has tended to be what happens in Canadian politics. People get tired of the Liberals for a while. They put them away for a bit. They elect Conservatives. They don't really want to, but they do it because the Liberals need to be punished. And then they'll have Conservatives for 5 to 10 years, and then Liberals will come back again, right? And that's just very much how kind of Canadian history has been in terms of electing Conservatives over Liberals. And I think we had a shot here, but to kind of say, well, be more like Trump, which is exactly who the Liberals were campaigning against, would have. I actually think the Liberals would have easily gotten a majority government by going in that direction.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, hindsight is 2020 though, right? I
Mm,
mean, it's hard to say. Um, and yeah, it's kind of an unfalsifiable thing. I
mm,
think yeah that Polyev really just kind of got dragged into a no-win situation. He was between a rock and a hard place because if he was sympathetic to Trump, to your point, the liberals would have crucified him over that, and if he was too mean to Trump, then it seemed to undermine his base support. So he really didn't have anywhere to run to and anywhere to hide, so to speak. The another symptom of Trump savior syndrome, though, that I kind of want to address is this idea that people have that if Trump says something they disagree with, what he really means is X. Right? Like this is the only politician in the world people do this with. Right? So people will say, "Well, yeah, I don't agree with tariffs either." But what Trump really wants is no tariffs. And I don't know where this idea comes from, right? There's this weird mind reading game that people do, right? Where they'll say, well, yeah, I don't think the tariffs are going to solve the fentanyl problem either. But what he's really trying to do is get Mark Carney reelected so that we can be more subverted by Chinese Communist Party in China. And then that will give him moral justification to annex Canada. Like that's a lot of steps of mental gymnastics. And I think if I am, and I also think that we sometimes overstate the importance of influencers too. Like how much do we really move the needle? I don't necessarily think all that much, because most of the people who are voting conservative were voting conservative anyway.
Mm,
But the difference between a majority and a minority in this election was something like 6,000 votes. So I don't think that it's impossible that we could have moved the needle
mm.
enough to have at least avoided a majority. And if you're a swing voter, and they do exist, there are still undecided voters, as partisan as this country is. There are still people who, between 30 and 45. If I'm watching CBC and they're saying that Trump is the worst person on earth and that the main crux of this election is whoever can push back against him the most, and then I switch to conservative independent media and they're talking about how great Trump is and how much they want to be annexed by the United States, it doesn't really like entice me to vote for the party that they attest in favor of,
Be
right?
supporting. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, it's not their obligation either
Mm,
to promote the Conservative Party of Canada. They're certainly not being paid to,
mm.
and they're under no obligation to. So, yeah, but at the same time, if we're going to be fighting this fight because it's an information war, I think maybe the next go around we should maybe just be more collaborative and more kind to each other, and not get as riled up over the wedge issues as we did in this last election.
Is that kind of the thesis here, that like for the next go around we need to spend and let's remind people too, there's provincial elections, there's municipal elections, there's all kinds of opportunities to kind of dial this in and be better. So is your main thesis, hey, let's be more collaborative, let's work together? Does it mean we have to parrot a party message? No, it doesn't. However, it does mean that if we want change, we all at least need to be consistent in what we're trying to project.
Yeah, and there was just a total abdication of responsibility on both sides. Again, on the liberal legacy media side, they were just not talking about election issues. Everything was about Donald Trump. I would consider their coverage to be kind of a mushroom trip of grievance
Mm.
politics as well, right? But at least it was a consistent mushroom trip. Ours, it was just we were just bouncing around from one thing to another. And again, just as responsible I am as anybody else. I mean, I was quite upset about the whole fentanyl issue because I thought that the claim that there was all this fentanyl coming over the northern border was very nebulous and not supported by data and evidence and
Mm.
facts, and I still believe that.
Mm.
And but I spent so much time arguing with other right wing influencers over this, and after the election, I kind of reflected on it. I thought, was that a productive use of my time in terms of getting the outcome that I wanted from this election? I don't personally think so. So I'm taking responsibility as much as I'm pointing
Well, and I
fingers.
think that's part of the reflection, and I don't think enough people do it. I think uh, I mean, look, I've had my share of reflections too. You don't go from the left to the right without having a lot of time to reflect on why. But I think it's healthy, Alex, and I think it's a good thing to do, because what that does is I think it builds the authenticity and the respect and the transparency of, look, we are out there, we are doing the work, we are commenting, we are writing, we are trying to shed some light on things that most people don't might not look at or might not consider, bring alternative perspectives, but be accountable to ourselves and to our audiences at the same time. So the state of play, Mark Carney. There's something like a dozen to 13 or 14 repeat cabinet ministers who were there before. Again, that number might be off, but who we do know is that Chrystia Freeland, Anita Anand, Stephen Guilbeault are still there. Francois Philippe Champagne is still there. These are folks, Sean Fraser, can't forget him, immigration and then housing, like two of the biggest clusterfucks that have really screwed
And now
things
he's
up.
the justice minister.
And now he's the justice minister. I
He
mean,
has the
talk
worst
about
job in Canada. So
failing upwards and sideways in every possible direction, right? And so we're not going to have a budget. Okay, now we are going to have a budget in the fall. Um, uh, Having Gregor Robertson, the new housing minister, saying, "Well, actually, we don't need to make housing more affordable." It's just like there's all kinds of weird shit that came out from this government in the very first week. Um, where are we going? We're going into a summer. Public safety is still a huge issue here in BC. I mean, we still have random stranger attacks. We still have issues with the need for compassion and intervention and compassionate care for folks, what is sometimes called involuntary care. Uh, Canada is trying to kind of limp into a new place of recovery, and it I don't know if we're there. I certainly don't feel like we're there. Where do you think we're at going into the summer of 2025 and coming into the fall?
yeah, I tend to agree with you. I mean, all of the main players are still in place. They've just kind of shuffled the deck on the Titanic, as they say, right? Which is kind of par for the course with this government. I One of the things I find most amusing is what was the point of the last cabinet shuffle? Like somebody like
Right.
Nathaniel Erskine Smith was the housing minister for a matter of weeks, and Parliament was prorogued anyway. Like how much could these people have possibly accomplished? And that actually really erodes any confidence I had in the Carney government at all. Right? It seems like they're very performative and very low on substance.
Mm,
Um, I mean, this has been a very long time. I attended the challenge to prorogation, which was largely
that's right.
through the Justice Center for Constitutional Freedoms in Ottawa. And it was really one of the interesting things about that case was the judge had mentioned technically under Canadian law, there is a scenario in which Parliament could meet for one day in a year and they would still be within the legal framework of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And it almost feels like because we're going into this parliamentary session, which I think is only a matter of weeks, and then we go into a summer break, it almost seems like that's kind of the course that this government wants to chart. And it feels like there's a real, kind of whittling away of our democratic institutions that I find really troubling.
Well, and we have the same thing here in BC, where we have a provincial government, right, that has had a pretty thin legislative agenda, so thin, in fact, and so inept that they've been unable to move bills forward because there's been so much opposition to them, and so they've had to invoke closure to get debate to end to force these bills through, which they're going to be doing next week, and it's wild to think and hear rumors in Victoria from many folks that they might not have a fall session this year in BC, which is just wild because you hear the government talking about all these other problems that exist and all the housing issues, all that stuff. I mean, technically, they don't need to pass a budget. There's no estimates this fall, so it literally is just question period and then government announcements. But and then bill debates, obviously. But you kind of wonder, like, to your point, in the United States, and this isn't me fawning for the United States, but the United States have a lot of elections, and they tend to have a pretty aggressive love of democracy down there. Up here, I don't want to sound catastrophic, but it to your point, it does kind of feel like there's a slow whittling away of the sense that we have democratic accountability. Now we still have elections, and I'm not trying to fearmonger here or anything like that, but to your point, if you can literally just have one sitting a year, and that's kind of seen as a justification, like how long until we like this session so far here in BC has only been 69 days out of the year. That's all that if they kill the fall session, they're only going to sit for 69 days
We've
this
had
year.
zero at the federal level.
Yeah, right,
Zero.
exactly.
I mean, we're heading into the summer and we've had 0 days parliament in session, which is crazy. I will say this to your point about the United States. So I've actually been to almost all 50 states. I spent quite a bit of time there in my youth, and I really like the United States, and I like Americans. I'm Trump agnostic, but the United States is a beautiful country. And one of the weirdest, like Canada and the United States, culturally incredibly similar. I
Very
sometimes
much
call
so.
Canada
Yeah.
the United States with Canadian commercials. Like we're basically the same country to some extent already. But one key difference politically and culturally is, and this occurred to me when I was at the Boston Public Library. I was sitting there and I was working on a paper back in my 20s, and I looked up and there was this giant portrait of George Washington. It was just massive. And I thought, I've never seen anything like this in Canada for a politician. And even if I did, I doubt that anybody would recognize who the politician was. Like
Right.
in
In
Canada,
fact, in Canada, we tear down statues of Sir John A. Macdonald, right? Like,
true.
yeah,
I mean, they do that, and that's also probably an importation of American politics too, because they were doing that with a lot of the Civil War characters in the
that's
South,
right.
and then we
Yeah.
kind of copycatted them on that. But the point I'm trying to make is we don't heroicize or lionize our politicians
Mm,
at all. And
mm,
in fact, even in this last election, I think it was historically consistent. In most elections in Canada, people don't vote for something; they vote
mm,
against things.
mm,
Right. So in this election, I don't think many people were voting for Carney; they were voting against Trump,
mm,
regardless of how irrational that is. That's just the way that the Canadian mind works politically. We don't like our politicians. We don't celebrate our politicians. We just tolerate them. Right. But that's totally different than the United States, right? Where they actually have historically had populist movements, whether it's William Jennings Bryan or
mm,
Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan. on all sides of the political spectrum. JFK,
Well, even Obama can be considered,
Obama,
certain huge populist figure from the last 20 years, right?
yeah, Abraham Lincoln. I mean,
Yeah.
they put presidents on their license plates, and
They put
they put
presidents on their mountains, Mount Rushmore, for
That's
goodness
right.
sake.
That's right. Like, could you imagine Canada would never, like, who would we even put up there? We'd more likely put up someone like Louis Riel, right? We lionize our people who are anti-politician,
Yeah.
right? And so that's very, very different. So I don't really know why I'm going on that tangent. I just think that it's worth mentioning because it explains some of the political behavior and why people don't get upset when our politicians don't do anything, because we have such low expectations that the disappointments are equally low.
Well, Canadians, when it comes to politics, are just largely kind of passively indifferent. I don't know if that's even the right. I think it's just completely indifferent. Um,
Apathetic.
yeah, it's just complete apathy, right? And I mean, that's kind of why I do what I do, and I'm sure it's one of the reasons why you do what you do, because we actually care about this stuff. We see it through a lens that we want people to understand, and we want to kind of bring the knowledge to other people to try to galvanize and generate some kind of interest in politics. And because it matters, right? Like, these are where the decisions are made, these are where the laws are made, these are where the things that impact us, whether it's local, provincial, federal. This shit matters, and we're out here doing it, sometimes yelling into the void. But if it wasn't that, we'd probably be beating our heads against walls. So this is certainly a healthier, healthier outlet.
I certainly hope so. And I mean, just yeah, returning to that thread that I wrote, another thing too that I saw on the conservative side, which just struck me as so counterproductive, was people would say, "Well, I'm voting conservative," and you'd say, "Well, how do you feel about topics A, B, and C?" And the person would say how they feel about it, and they'd go, "Well, you're not a real conservative." Like, I can't think of anything that would be less productive in terms of getting votes
Yeah.
than alienating the people who are already going to vote for you.
Yeah. Well, and actually, this is a point I was trying to make earlier on, and I think I trailed off. But when I came into the Conservative Party, I was talking with folks, and I actually learned how big a tent the Conservative movement actually is. It's far bigger than people understand. Like, when I talk to someone like Adam Zivo, who writes for the National Post, when I talk to someone like Raheem Mohammed, again, writes for the National Post, Tristan Hopper, who, again, National Post, lives here in Victoria. These are folks who all, I mean, generally they have different life experiences, different perspectives on things. However, they are all within kind of the branch of the Conservative movement, and there, it's more than just them too, right? There's lots here. Look here in British Columbia, Eleanor Sturko, lesbian conservative MLA for Surrey Cloverdale, right? Like, there's lots of space and room. Melissa Lantsman, who's the federal deputy a leader of the Conservative Party, again, a Jewish lesbian from Thornhill. Like, there's all kinds of, and I think that's wherein, and I think maybe I'll just wrap on this piece. I think that's where the identity politics stuff is so rotten, is it's gotten us to get used to dividing each other on immutable qualities that we have no control over, right? Instead of actually looking at the things that bring us together, things that of our character, things of our accomplishments and achievements, and ways that we can help lift each other up and improve each other. I mean, that may sound a bit rose colored glasses, but I think that's actually what humanity should really be about. And politics is kind of about segmenting and dividing. I mean, that's just how politics works. But on the identity politic woke side, I think the challenge there really is it looks to divide people by things that they have no control over, which is incredibly ironic.
Yeah, and I mean, like, one of the great accomplishments of the Trump political movement is that the thing I love most about American politics right now is that you have two political tents that, if you look inside of them, are completely incoherent. So like, on the Trump side, you have the old religious right. God bless them. They're always going to be around, and those are your pro-lifers and whatever.
Mm,
They're always going to be Republicans. But then they're aligned with these frat boys wearing red hats who love the fact that Trump dated a porn star, right? So like that, like, if you look in that tent, you're like, I don't really know how these people are managing to get along. And then, of course, on the other side, you've got Queers for Palestine,
right.
right? So like, that
Yeah.
doesn't make any sense either.
Yeah.
And but both sides seem to be happily united over really nothing, and the liberals, and they're also very happily united over nothing, whereas the conservatives are just constantly infighting over just about anything, and they're looking to eject people from the tent over the smallest issues.
Mm,
And I just don't think that that's ever going to be a successful way to do politics, because politics, ultimately, it's from the ground up, and we're
mm,
responsible for the party, not the leadership, right? I
mm.
mean, it's the body of the party that really determines the health of the party. And so yeah, I think maybe we just need to be nicer to each other if possible. If not, that's okay too. You know.
It's a great note to end on, Alex. I do think there needs to be a lot more kindness in politics because we all, and look, this might also be super like lame to say. I genuinely believe that anyone who gets into politics does it because they want to change things, because something pushed them to want to get involved to make either their life better, their community better, their family better, their children better, their grandkids better. There's a specific issue that got them motivated to get involved. I genuinely believe that. And so if we can kind of like, let's just start at that base, right? Like, why do you want to change things and make things better? And maybe we can build from there and kind of find some commonalities. I don't know. Maybe that's too wishful, but I think we can get there. Alex, we're out of time, but before I let you go, where can people find out and learn more about the great work that you do?
Well, thank you so much. I'm on X mostly, and I'm a crime reporter for True Northwire. You can find a lot of my stories on Juno News as well. And yeah, if you're looking to support any of my work, I recommend that people support True North because they're a great organization. We're one of the few independent journalist organizations in Canada that receives no subsidies from the government for media. And so, yeah, I encourage people to support us if you can.
I will include links to True North and Juno, and of course you in the show notes of the podcast. Alex Zoltan, reporter for True North Wire, and fantastic human being doing the Lord's work out there. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.